Welcome to Edison Open House Global Healthcare 2022. In this session, we're looking at the work of Botanix Pharmaceuticals, a dermatology-focused company. And I'm delighted to be joined by its Executive Director, Matt Callahan. Hello, Matt.
How are you? Thanks for having us.
So you're specialising in dermatology, and at one end of the dermatology field, we're seeing a lot of new drugs for psoriasis, the JAK inhibitors for atopic dermatitis, but they're really very heavy duty, lot of side effects. And there's a huge area of mild to moderate skin disease, which isn't really being addressed. And is that the particular market sector that you're going for?
Yeah, absolutely. So the target for us is in that mild to moderate space. As you mentioned, the most recent approvals of drugs like Opzelura from Incyte have been targeted at the more severe forms of these diseases. And those drugs are really effective. But I guess the issue that we're seeing is that many of them are coming with a significant side effect baggage, such that the prescribing label, kind of looks horrible. It's, malignancies, risks of death, cardiovascular issues. And so developing products for that kind of middle ground, so that the mild to moderate patients, has really been neglected. In some cases, there's been no new mechanism of action approved in areas like acne for more than 25 years.
And some of the creams and potions that people are looking back really date back to the 40s and 50s. I mean, they're not really very pleasant to use either. Steroid creams and aqueous creams, really not very good at all. You have a proprietary skin delivery technology, Proprietary. Tell me a bit more about that. How does it work? And what are the advantages compared to other ways of delivering medicines for the skin?
Yeah, so in dermatology, it's kind of been pretty much the same thing for a very long time. So traditionally, when you make a cream or a gel, you're including a chemical which is called a permeation enhancer. And the job of that chemical is really to open up the pores of the skin to let the drug kind of go through. And we've used the same permeation enhancers, and I'm talking about things like alcohols and petrol extracts for literally decades. So what we set out to do is to create a safer and a less irritating delivery system, and we decided to use medical grade silicons. And so what we do is we dissolve up our drug in these medical grade silicons, which are very volatile, i.e. they evaporate. And so very quickly after application to the skin, and I've kind of got some here, as soon as you apply the gel or the cream to the skin and you rub that on, within 5 or 10 seconds, most of the formulation has evaporated. And that kinetic effect of evaporation actually concentrates the drug and drives it in the opposite direction into the skin. So it's a very effective way of getting a lot of drug into the skin, but it doesn't use those irritating or drying chemicals that have traditionally been used in dermatology.
That's a really neat approach. Now, one of the particular skin conditions that you're looking at is rosacea, which is a really distressing skin problem. Where are you with that?
Yeah, so we're currently in the middle of phase 1b/2 clinical study that we're running out of Australia and New Zealand at the moment. And so rosacea, we probably all know someone who's had rosacea, the reddening of the cheeks and the reddening of the nose often, but we're dealing with a particular type called papular-pustular, which has kind of acne-like lesions on the skin. So that study is looking at recruiting about 120 subjects. We kicked it off back in June, July of this year. We've said to the market we'll have this fully recruited by the middle of 2022. And what we're aiming to show there is that up against a vehicle or a placebo, 2 different doses of our BTX 1702 provides relief, obviously, from a safety and a tolerability point of view, but also clearing up that acne-like lesion on the face, reducing the redness and providing an overall benefit to the patient.
And what does this mean for your other dermatology programs?
Yeah, so rosacea, obviously having a combination of kind of inflammation and some form of bacterial infection, is a really good model for the other dermatological conditions that we're studying in dermatitis and obviously acne. So with this study, we've gone to a higher dose than what we've done in other studies. And to our earlier discussion, it's kind of one of these things, we've been very fortunate with synthetic CBD, which is our active, that we can dose that very high and we don't see side effects. So in the more than 700 or 800 patients that we've treated to date, we haven't seen any adverse events that have been attributable to this drug. And that's kind of unusual. So usually the higher you go with a drug dose, the worse those side effects get, but we're not seeing that. So good efficacy with safety, they're kind of the two pillars that we build our dermatology programs on.
It's really interesting, isn't it, that people think of cannabinoids as being primarily things for perhaps mental health, think about the cannabinoid system in the brain, but actually for dermatology, it's really, really promising.
It is, yeah. It's one of those strange situations where you've got a drug that does two things. So it's pretty widely understood that CBD is anti-inflammatory, but it's also very antimicrobial. And we published a paper in Nature at the start of this year, one of the Nature publications, which shows that it's effective against basically all gram-positive bacteria, things like staph, things like P. acnes or Cutibacterium. And that kind of, two effects or two mechanisms in one is really important, because when you go to the dermatologist often for things like acne and dermatitis, they'll actually give you two different drugs. They'll give you an antimicrobial and they'll give you an anti-inflammatory. Here we've got both of those activities together in one drug, but with the bonus that it's also very, very safe.
Now, you've got a phase 3 study for acne. Tell me a bit more about that and how that's getting along.
Yeah, so we completed the phase 2B about 18 months ago. We had an end of phase 2 meeting with the FDA to get some guidance on the endpoints for the study. So we're basically set up to go into that phase 3 study. We've delayed the start of that partially through the challenges of running studies during COVID across multiple countries, but also we want to see the data from our Rosacea study at that higher dose. Because if we can push that dose a lot higher, we should see better efficacy from our acne program, but also avoiding those increased side effects that we don't expect to see.
Now, you mentioned the antimicrobial efficacy that you're seeing, and you're also taking that beyond dermatology into hemodialysis patients. Now, these are patients where Staph aureus contamination is a big issue. And the FDA, I know, have granted a lot of incentives. How are you doing on that?
Yeah, so this is kind of a different platform from our straight dermatology platform. So here we're just using solely the antimicrobial properties of CBD to kill bacteria. In this case, we're doing it inside the nose or the nares, because these hemodialysis patients are going in to have their blood cleaned about 3 times a week. And in the US, unfortunately, that happens in kind of a clinic environment in a strip mall, 6 chairs. They come in, they sit there for 4 or 5 hours. Unfortunately, the nose sits right above the catheter, just in their chest, that goes directly into their heart. And so reducing the amount of bacteria that come out of the nose into that catheter and reducing bloodstream infections is our focus. So having had a successful study back in March, April of this year that we announced, we're starting another human study, which will kick off our 2B in Q1, end of Q1 of next year. And that study should be completed well before the end of next year. And that's a really important study because we're treating patients over a 9-week period to show that we can reduce the amount of bacteria that's coming out of their nose and obviously infecting other parts of their body.
Now, potentially that's a hugely interesting avenue to explore because the market there is huge. What's your IP strategy?
Yeah, so from a market perspective, these hemodialysis patients have nothing for nasal decolonisation. So we're going to be the first in that market. So from an IP perspective, we look to protect each of the programs that we have with different formulations, different doses, and different routes of administration. So the basic molecule CBD obviously is a naturally identified molecule. We use a synthetic form of that. So there's some IP around the way in which it's manufactured. There's IP around the dose that works for a particular disease. And then there's IP around the actual clinical data that we generate for each of these programs.
Now, over the coming months, as we go into 2022, what should investors be looking out for?
Yeah, so we've got a number of programs reading out from a data perspective within the couple of months leading into the start of 2022. So first off, we expect to see data from a canine study that we're running with an atopic dermatitis model. We're expecting that in Q1. That will be followed by data from our Rosacea study. We said to the market that we'll be finishing that in the middle of next year. We'll also be commencing our BTX 1801 antimicrobial study that we just talked about. And we're also looking to bring on board a number of other assets that kind of can be leveraged with our delivery technology that aren't necessarily cannabinoids. So this is a great time to be in dermatology. Many of the small to medium-sized companies have been gobbled up by the bigger pharma companies. And so there's a real dearth of innovation, and that innovation generally comes from those small to medium companies. So we're aiming to broaden our platform to really provide an M&A target for those larger companies as we move into the next 18 to 24 months.
And just to pick you up on one thing that was particularly interesting, this canine testing model, I think you used it with atopic dermatitis. What's that done for you? Because presumably it means faster trials.
Yeah, it does. And it's a great way of kind of getting a signal. So canines who suffer from hotspots or dermatitis-like lesions from a physiological basis and just from the pathology of the disease are very similar to how humans experience that. The only difference really being that, you know, the nails, the claws of the dog kind of scratch and kind of cause more damage than the human nails do. So it's a good way of testing the drug. It's a good way of seeing a signal, and then with those positive signals, taking them into human clinical studies to follow up on that efficacy and safety profile.
And do you think there'll be any pushback from a potential future customer base?
Yeah, so there's actually going to be a diversion. So positive data from our canine program will actually lead us into a canine development program, which we're likely to partner with one of the many animal health. So for dermatitis in canines, it's about a $750 million a year market with only 2 products owned by the same company. So a great opportunity there for a kind of a spin-off. And then on the human side, it's a great model, just like we do animal models before we go into the clinic with most drugs. It's a great model to give us some information. Ultimately, the human clinical data is really what carries the day.
It's been such a pleasure talking to you, and what an interesting area to be in at this very, very innovative time. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thanks, Vivienne.